Hit Kickin' Country, Z94. It's Wild Bill in the midday. Dan Spencer, a contributor to Red State. He is from Connecticut, a very successful lawyer. He joins us once again. Hello, Dan. How are you?
Hi, Bill. Good. Good to be here.
Well, you came out with a new diary entry on redstate.com talking about a new Heritage Action poll finding broad support for defunding Obamacare. Tell us a little bit about this poll.
This poll is really important. They're very careful in how they worded the questions. You know, that always makes a big difference in the polling results. But they found that likely voters support defunding of Obamacare 57 to 34% overall. And I found really interesting the independents supported by the exact same numbers, 57-34. And matter of fact, only 42% of Democrats fully embrace Obamacare. Actually, 17% of them actually favor repealing Obamacare.
So I guess it tells you that this is not necessarily a Democrat or Republican thing. There's a sizable majority out there that want to get rid of this in the end.
You know, poll after poll after poll shows that Obamacare is becoming more and more unpopular. The more the president's out there trying to talk people into supporting it, the worse the number it gets for it. You've got Fox News, Gallup, and Rasmussen all show, if not majorities, the larger number of people want it changed at least and gone if possible. I tell you, I was out in flyover country part of California last week on a family wedding, and several people that I talked to, a lot of friends of my extended family who I hardly know, but those people are mad out there. They want this thing gone.
And I think one of the things about this new Heritage Action poll, it really does a laser focus when it talks to about defunding Obamacare, which is the current debate going on right now. The Basswood Research Group, they had 10 GOP-leaning districts, and now one of those districts polled is Georgia 12, John Barrow's district, and there is a lot of pressure on him right now. He is a Democrat, a conservative Democrat in our district, and there's a lot of pressure being put on him to defund this. Tell me a little bit about how the samples were taken in this poll with all of these GOP-leaning districts.
Well, they did it in these 10 districts. I think 6 of them were represented by Republican congressmen at this point, and 4 of them are represented by Democratic congressmen. These are all the Republican or Republican-leaning districts, but they think overall it pretty much is representative of a nationwide sample. They took at least 100 likely voters in each district and interviewed them live, not robocalls, and the results were pretty good. And besides the results that we already mentioned about how unfavorable people are towards Obamacare, they also some really interesting numbers that if the Republicans pass a continuing resolution in the House to fund the entire government except for Obamacare, and then it becomes up to President Obama whether he wants to shut down the government or not. And if he chooses to, the blame is going to be shared. I mean, slightly more for the Republican, but very close. The people are going to share the blame and say both people did it wrong. So it's not going to be a great debacle for the Republicans if they stand their ground and don't fund Obamacare, and part of the blame will be on the Democrats and the president.
And it's interesting that the way that the Heritage Foundation put this poll together, one of the questions they ask is, who's going to be blamed for this? And there's not this widespread support that they think that the GOP is going to be blamed for this. I mean, this game was played before by Barack Obama with the whole sequester. The sequester hasn't been blamed on Republicans so far. That has seemed to be played out fairly well for the GOP. You would think they would look back at that and think, okay, this should be a piece of cake. Let's go ahead and defund this, and there's not going to be a whole lot of political fallout because of it.
We see a lot of resistance among the what I call the establishment Republicans. They're really afraid to do this for some reason. They keep harkening back to Newt Gingrich days when they actually had a shutdown a couple of times in late '94 and early '95 with, or maybe it was '95 or '96. I get my years mixed up sometimes with President Clinton. But if they hadn't done that, we wouldn't have gotten the welfare. We wouldn't have forced President Clinton to give us the welfare reform. We wouldn't have forced President Clinton to go on and give us a balanced budget. That only happened after the short and then the longer shutdown. And people say, well, that was terrible for us, but it wasn't terrible for us. We didn't lose our majorities. We didn't lose either house, the House or the Senate. Some people say, well, perhaps it allowed President Clinton to be reelected, but well, so be it. But he's a pretty good politician. He might have figured out how to do that anyway. A majority would be less likely to support reelection efforts of House members who voted to continue Obamacare funding. And 48% of those people said that they would be more likely to support a member who did everything they could to slow down the implementation of the law. So I think any way you look at it, this poll really supports defunding Obamacare.
Well, I sure hope that representatives here in Georgia definitely see that, and they see these polls and they understand that's what's at stake, is that, you're not going to lose the House because you're fighting Obamacare, you're fighting to defund it with a possible government shutdown thanks to the Democrats. That has nothing to do with it. The fact is that if you don't vote to defund it, you're in trouble. You could lose your seat.
Yes, and one other thing that's really annoying these days is it doesn't help your case any when you allow the federal government to do a special deal just for elected members of Congress and their staff so that they're not going to suffer the entire impact of Obamacare as it's written. That does not help, and that's just going to annoy people even more.
Karl Rove has come out, and we've probably heard him several times on Fox News and other radio outlets and sources, news sources, where he's been touting polls about defunding, where he ties it to shutting down the government. So he leads those kinds of questions when it comes to talking about shutting down the government to get the result that he wants. And it's a very suspicious poll when you really start looking at the data and what questions are asked.
That's really true. We have to be very careful here. This is a really important thing with regard to the rhetoric that's used on how you describe it. And you see so many of the establishment Republicans talking about shutting down the government. The thing to do here is the Republicans shouldn't be talking about shutting down the government. We're not trying to shut down the government. What we want to have happen is we want the House to pass the continuing resolution that funds the entire federal government, except for anything to do with Obamacare. Just that one thing. Everything else will be funded. And then leave it up to the Democrats and President Obama to decide if they want to shut down the government over Obamacare so they can continue to shove it down our throats.
All right, there we go. It's Dan Spencer from redstate.com. You can read his story, The People Support Defunding Obamacare. We'll provide all the links on our website for you to check out and actually hear this interview as well. Dan Spencer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Bill. It's been a pleasure.